In this paper, I interpret the state ideology of the Islamic Republic of Iran through an examination of its process of making a representational place, namely the Islamic Period Museum, to which I shall refer as the IPM. This museum, pictured on the right, is part of the National Museum of Iran and was established through the refurbishment of the former Ethnographic Museum. It was an extension to the existing National Museum, the Ancient Iran Museum, which dates back to 1936 and is pictured on the left. Despite the modernist style of the building's architecture, which belongs to the European monumental period of the 1930s, the interior was refurbished and transformed to suit the exhibition of artifacts of the Islamic period. I argue that ostensibly the IPM represents the nation's Islamic identity through the arrangement of artifacts, that is, the curatorial narrative. However, I will demonstrate that the museum reproduces the official Islamist ideology. Behind the appearance of a coherent place, the museum conceals inconsistencies and ambiguities inherent in Islamism, as well as its mode of mass inculcation, being the invocation of the familiar sense of the everyday religious experience. I shall begin by defining the state ideology and its components, and then introducing the IPM. There I will mainly focus on the most pertinent elements of the curatorial narrative, and exhibition of Quranic manuscripts at the heart of the museum in particular. Islamism, as a general concept, encompasses different strands of the ideology that dominated the 1979 revolution of Iran and has since become the state ideology of the Islamic Republic. The origins of Islamism are in the late 19th century events that were part of the elite-driven process of transforming Iran into a modern nation-state. At that time, Islamic modernists attempted to reconcile their identity, that is, Islamic identity, with European Enlightenment, a move that could have resulted in a version of Islamic nationalism. However, their ideals were not realized as secular nationalism dominated the political discourse, and by the early 20th century, a nationalist state, namely the Pahlavis, a monarchy reigning between 1925 and 1979, who had a westernizing and secularizing agenda, came to power. Toward the latter part of the century, the westernizing trends of the state caused growing unease among some educated elite and the more conservative sectors of the society. Those trends, they thought, would result in the loss of authentic Iranian identity. Islamism was one of the responses fashioned to the state ideology. It drew on tenets of Shiism and was deceptively familiar to the public in its appropriation of mythology, jargon, and rituals. Drawing on such emotional and cultural connections, Islamism enlisted mass support for the revolution and the leadership of the clergy. Reacting to the ideology and cultural policies of the previous establishments, the Islamic Republic promoted an Islamic identity as the authentic identity of Iranians. The Islamic Period Museum of Iran reproduces and represents in its curatorial narrative and spatial arrangement the Islamist ideology of the state. Before discussing the museum, it is useful to elaborate on the components of Islamism. It comprises the following three tendencies: Pan-Islamism, also known as Islamic unity, Islamic authenticity, and traditionalism. The first two are responses to enlightenment as a result of East-West encounters and invoke interpretations of Shiite or Islamic identity and practices. Traditionalism, on the other hand, invoked an interpretation of Islamic tradition, which in the Iranian context was expressed through a resurgence of the mystical outlook exemplified in Sufism. The first component of Islamism is Pan-Islamism, a modern invention that followed the formation of nation-states when identification with and loyalties to the nation were beginning to transcend denominational limits. Pan-Islamism was a consequence of local encounters with Western imperial conquests, modernism, and the application of the Enlightenment ideal of a universal reason. Pan-Islamist thought is characterized by the incorporation of Western thought into an Islamic outlook. Thus, a certain measure of Islamic revivalism to suit modern conditions, and political militancy against foreign domination. Pan-Islamists attempt to transcend or even mend confessional divides and consider Muslims as a united nation based in Islamic lands, a territory where Western encroachments. The proponents of Pan-Islamism were the militant clergy, lay preachers, traditional merchants, and other socially and culturally conservative classes of the society. The critique that they leveled against the nationalist and westernizing government was that their policies had caused the Iranian society and politics to become inauthentic. In response, they wished to return to and reinterpret the basic tenets of religion. A second constituent of Islamism may be identified as Islamic authenticity. Anti-imperialism, Islamic revivalism, and a critical response to Western Enlightenment, which initially figured in Islamic unity, were also incorporated in this movement. Islamic authenticity became very much fashionable in the 1970s in Islamic countries, and it was a major contributing factor to the Islamic Revolution and its ideology. This movement is fundamentally romantic. It has a revolutionary impulse, and it reacted against the Pahlavi state policies, which were modernizing, westernizing, and nationalist. It advocated instead a return to native traditions. However, it reinterpreted those traditions in light of modernity and the Western Enlightenment. Therefore, it was incorporating a critical knowledge of the West as much as it was incorporating a critique of local traditions. However, like any other authenticity movement, it was and remains prone to fascism. The third component of Islamism is traditionalism. Islamic unity and Islamic authenticity are attempts to repel imperialism and furnish a response to the crisis it caused in the East. Traditionalism, on the other hand, is an attempt to redress the disillusionment with modernity and Western rationality felt by the 20th century intellectuals, initially in the West, but later globally. The founder of 20th century traditionalism, René Guénon, endeavored to restore to the West an appropriate traditional civilization, a divine order which emphasizes the immutability of traditions and their sacred aspects. This essentially modern movement is in the East merged with Sufism, which is a mystical movement within Islam that seeks to find divine love and knowledge through direct personal experience of God, or a truth, with a capital T. Traditionalism is in spirit removed from Islamic authenticity. Rather, its emphasis on the unity of all being under the aegis of religion and an ideal origin located in a romanticized golden past brings it closer to Pan-Islamism. In the Iranian society, with its powerful, often living Sufi traditions and religious belief, traditionalism appeared as the continuation of the existing customs and penetrated significant areas of Iranian life and politics. Islamism was born from the confluence of the above three tendencies that are not fully congruent. As a syncretic ideology, it has remained ambiguous and riddled with internal contradictions. For example, Islamic authenticity's critique of tradition is antithetical to the glorification of tradition by traditionalists, while they both posit their own different constructed origins for tradition. Nevertheless, the ideology galvanized much of the revolutionary activities, mass support, and the events that followed the revolution. What these three strands have in common is firstly a rejection of the West, westernization, and modernity on Western terms as symbolized by the deposed monarchy, that is the Pahlavis. And secondly, they drew their impetus from familiar traditions, much of which are dominated by the ethos of Shi'ism. The core question of Islamism has been over the relevance of native traditions to the contemporary conditions of Iran. Attempts to formulate a response to that question have informed the definition of heritage and heritage policies, and their practical outcomes have become manifest in the curatorial narrative of the IPM, where objects are narrated in accordance with Islamic art and philosophy.